Hi, welcome to the first of our videos for History 1302. This is going to be a lecture over Chapter 16, America's Gilded Age. So let me get situated here. All right. So America's Gilded Age. So just kind of start off talking about what is the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age is a way of referring to this time period of around 1870 to around 1890, but it also goes a little beyond 1890. Your book is using those dates because it's just going to focus on things from those dates. But, if I was appending a date on the Gilded Age, I'd probably say like 1870 to 1900 or so. And it overlaps with another era that is around the same time frame, about the same amount of years, but goes a little further usually, called the Progressive Era. And typically, when we talk about the Progressive Era versus the Gilded Age, what we're kind of talking about is when we talk about the Gilded Age, we tend to focus on negativity, on negative things. We talk about, rampant capitalism without any regard for, human life um, or living conditions of the poor or working conditions of the working class. Or we're talking about the we're talking sorry, something's on my desk here. We're talking about the rampant pollution that's destroying the environment. We're talking about just these incredibly wealthy businessmen, these robber barons who control not just business but society and even the government, right? So we're talking about that kind of stuff, a lot of negative things, not to mention racism and imperialism and so on. And we talk about the Progressive Era, we tend to focus on the good stuff, the people like Jane Addams and W.E.B. Du Bois and Eugene Debs, who are coming out and standing up against these things, who are fighting for immigrants and the poor and African Americans and so on, right? Who are fighting, against these big businesses, this unfettered, unregulated capitalism, right? But really, they're the same time frame, and it's just two ways of talking about the same topic. And there's good stuff going on in the Gilded Age. There's bad stuff going on in the Progressive Era. There's people involved in the Gilded Age who are doing some of the stuff that we would see as bad, who maybe had better intentions than we give them credit for, or who also did good things. And there's people that we look at like, oh, they're doing good stuff for the Progressive Era. They're very progressive and taking care of society, but they also had some very problematic stuff going on. So it's just two ways of thinking about the same thing, but your book is going to separate them completely, just for, thematic reasons. And it's going to go kind of chronologically. So chapter 16 is going to be the Gilded Age, 1870 to 1890. And then chapter 18 is going to be the Progressive Era, and it's going to date it as like 1900 to 1914 or something like that. Okay. So anyway, so let's just go ahead and get started. I'm using the study guide that you can find in your content tab under Unit 1. And so I'm looking at this is our Unit 1 study guide, chapter 16 through, I believe, 20. And so looking at chapter 16, the first item on here is the industrial economy. I'm not going to be covering every single topic on here. I'm going to skip over some. You'll want to look into those on your own when reading. I'm just going to cover some of the big stuff. So industrial economy. What they talk about here is how the United States, just becomes this, undergoes this rapid, profound economic revolution, probably the most rapid and incredibly important and just massive economic change in all of civilization. And there's a few reasons that America is able to have this big economic boom, this big industrial boom. One, abundant natural resources like coal and iron, lots of that stuff, oil. Two, growing labor supply due to immigration. Three, expanded market for manufactured goods due to American imperialism, and meaning we could sell to more people. And four, a federal government that actively promoted business, that a federal government that actively promoted both industrial and agricultural development in the form of protective tariffs, land grants to companies like the railroads, especially, and using the U.S. Army to commit genocide against the Native Americans, freeing up land and natural resources for that industrial economy. And so I've got a chart, I think, here. Yeah, so you can see here. So farms, you know, there's what we see 2.7 million farms in 1870 and 6.4 million in 1920. So farming is still growing, but look at the percentage in the workforce. 52% of the workforce is agricultural in 1870. By 1920, it's only 27%. So even though farming is growing, industry is growing so much more. Railroad, which is kind of the driving force of this industrial revolution, we have 53,000 miles of track in 1870, 407,000 miles of track in 1920. And you can see the results on our gross national product, which is just the total wealth being generated by the country, not adjusted for inflation or anything else, goes from 7.4 billion to 91.5 billion. And when adjusted for both inflation and population, the per capita growth is 371 to 920. So even accounting for inflation, which is the process of things getting more expensive over time, or money becoming worth less over time, even with that, and even accounting for the massive boom in population, the gross national product per person, that's what per capita means, per person, is going up, nearly tripling, not quite tripling. Kind of double and a halfening. And life expectancy is going up from 42 to 54. Now, that brings me to something I do want to bring up. Life expectancy. People, and I mean almost all people, really misunderstand how life expectancy works. So you hear like, oh, well, back in 1870, the life expectancy was 42 years. You're like, wow, people lived until they were 42 and then they died? No, that's not how life expectancy works. People lived to be 100 in 1870, just like they do today. How life expectancy works is every year you look at all the people that died and you look at what age they were, and then you take the average, and that's the life expectancy. So you could have tens of thousands of people living to be 100. But if you've also got more than tens of thousands of people dying, in infancy, dying when they're a month old, you have lots of babies dying, then your life expectancy is not going to be 100. It's going to go down. So life expectancy is an average of the age of death of every person that dies. So when you see life expectancy is like, oh, well, back then, I've heard this one before, like in church. They're like, oh, well, in this guy's time, life expectancy was only 42, or was only 40 years old. So actually, 12 years old was quite old for a lady. It's like, no, that's not how life expectancy works. Really what is happening here is that we have a really high infant mortality rate. And we have a higher death rate just overall because of all these uncured diseases and unsafe, unsanitary conditions and misunderstandings of the science and so on. All right, well, anyway, let's move on. I mentioned railroads are this driving force, and we saw just railroad construction just got so much more massive. You see it drops off real sharp in the teens and 20s. The automobile becomes really big in about 1914. 1916. By 1920, the automobile industry has utterly replaced railroads as the, pun intended, driving force of the economy. But for this little period between 1860 and 1920, railroads are supreme. One thing, and you can see here, this is a railroad network just by 1880. One thing you might note, you know what? I need to turn on my laser pointer. Boom. You see that? Yeah. So you see, might not be able to completely tell, but so much of the railroads converge on Chicago. And Chicago becomes kind of the epicenter of this industrial revolution. Like it's also happening all over the, from New York, Pennsylvania, but Chicago That's the epicenter of this industrial revolution in America. And all the railroads go there, and that is both because of that and also causes that. Anyway, what's really helping the railroads big time, though, is land grants from the federal government. So you want to talk the biggest grift in all of American history, right? All right, get this. This railroad right here, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, goes from San Francisco to St. Louis. Right, right. Well, not quite St. Louis, but you get the idea. It's going towards Chicago. There it is. Boom. That's called the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, transcontinental means it crosses the continent. Well, that's only crossing half. But remember, it's going to this hub in Chicago, which then connects everything else. All right, so this Transcontinental Railroad was paid for by the federal government, which means it was paid for by the taxpayers, right? Though there is no federal income tax back then, but we've got tariffs, which are taxes on imports. We've got the sale of public land, right? So anyway, the federal government's paying this. They pay for this railroad to be built. Well, the federal government doesn't have its own construction company, right? They pay other companies, federal contractors, right? And so they pay two companies that are created for the building of this railroad, Union Pacific and Central Pacific. Union Pacific, the idea was they were going from the Union to the Pacific. Central Pacific, the idea they're going from the center of the United States to the Pacific. Either way, two companies, similar names. It's just Union Pacific. Union Pacific owns Central Pacific, Northern Pacific, Southern Pacific, Atlantic Pacific, Atlantic and Pacific. But anyway, and so they get the contracts. The two of them get to share the contract, right? And they are paid per mile of track they lay, right? So Central Pacific starts in San Francisco and builds east. Union Pacific starts in wherever this is. Looks like, what is that? It's not Minnesota. Is that Missouri still? No, Illinois. Sorry. Starts in Illinois here and goes west. They end up meeting at Promontory Point, Utah, in 74. I know Grant was president, but anyway, so they're being paid per mile of track. Awesome. But this is where the grift comes in. When it's over, you know who owns that railroad? Union Pacific and Central Pacific. Not the federal government, who paid for the railroad. Imagine, this is like you hire a construction company to build a house. You pay them for the house. You buy the land, right? You buy the land the house is going to be on. You pay for all the materials. You hire a company to build it. They build it for you. And then when it's all over, they own it outright. And they get to charge you rent to live there. That's what the railroads did here. The federal government gave them the land to build the railroad on, paid them to build it, and then they own it when it's over. The federal government gets to use it all they want, but the taxpayers, who ultimately are the ones who paid for it, they've still got to buy tickets. If they are farmers and they're trying to ship crops, or if they're a business owner, maybe they own a mine or something, or a factory, and they're trying to put their materials or their products on the railroad, they've got to pay freight charges, even though it's our railroad that we paid for. But we gave it to the people who built it, who we paid to build it. And on top of all that, if you look on this map here, you see the shaded area, the different colorings, these shadings represent how much land was given to the railroads. Now, I'm not a scientist or a mathematician, but I figure for a railroad tracks are what, like 8 feet wide, right? About that. And then you got to have like an embankment on both sides, call that another 10 feet on each side, call it 28. Let's be, maybe there's a double track. Let's be real liberal with it and say you need 50 feet of land to either side of the track, right? I mean, total, right? You need 50 feet. Even if you need 100 feet. Is that 100 feet? No, it's more like 100 miles. The federal government gives the railroads a massive amount of land to build the railroads on, and they get to keep all of it. Now, some of it they ended up forfeiting by not meeting contracts, and so the darker, not red. So you can see it's really kind of hard to make out on here, but you can see how this down here in the Arizona territory, how it's like a darker shade. That is, you'll also notice there's no red line there, no orange line there. That's because they didn't end up finishing the railroad there. So they had to give the land back. But as long as they finished it, they got the land. So all this land here. And you know what? As the country is, as the country's moving westward and they're building this railroad, all that land within, 50 miles either direction of the railroad is the most valuable land in the West, which they can then flip and sell. I tell you, it's the biggest grift in history. It's a straight up scam. And it worked, and it made the railroads insanely expensive, incredibly expensive. These railroad companies become the biggest businesses on earth with more money than most nations. It's absolute insanity, and it's all a scam. And it was because they owned Congress. The Congress people were bribed. We don't call it bribes in America. We call it lobbying, but it's the same thing. Companies giving money to elected officials, so those elected officials will do things they want. And this is all over the place still today, but man, this has got to be the biggest scam ever. So anyway, that is the railroads. I'm going to skip over inventions, and I want to move on to a topic that is often difficult for students to understand, which is pools and trust. So pools and trust are two financial tactics used by businesses in the Gilded Age in order to gain monopolies or near monopolies. Pooling is currently very much a federal crime. It's illegal. No one goes to jail for it. You pay fines. Maybe your company gets broken up. That, of course, depends on the people in charge of regulating those things actually being in favor of regulating those things, which changes every 4 to 8 years. But depending on the elections, or maybe not, but depending on the elections, it changes back and forth, because typically you have one party that's more in favor of those regulations, one party that's less in favor. But honestly, both parties tend to say that they're against them and then be in favor of them more often than not. So whatever. Anyway, point is pools are illegal. Trusts are not illegal, but the way they're being used is. To the point that trust becomes so associated with monopolistic business practices that the entire field of laws that regulate businesses to prevent monopolies are called antitrust laws. So anyway, let's talk about pools first. My thing over here, that direction, that thing right there. Sorry, I was like, well, I'm pointing which is mirrored, right there. That thing, it's not mirrored. That's the problem. This is not a polling. This is not a poll. I don't really have a picture for polls, but polls are really easy to understand, trust or not. So I've got a trust diagram there, which is also just confusing, honestly. But let's talk about polls first. Polling is where you have multiple businesses in the same industry that are supposed to be competitors who, instead of competing with each other, work together to benefit each other. And you're like, oh, that's nice, right? We want cooperation. No, not in capitalism. If capitalism works, it works as long as there is fair competition. When there's not fair competition, capitalism does not actually work, at least not for the consumers or the workers. So the idea that competition is supposed to be the check on capitalism that keeps it from overrunning the little folk, right? If Netflix wants to compete with Hulu, right? Netflix has got to either offer a better product or a lower price. Ideally, they want to offer a better product and a lower price. But I said they want to. They don't want to do either of those things. Netflix would absolutely love to offer a very high price, and they could not possibly give a crap about the quality of the product they're producing, which, talking about art as a product is kind of depressing, but you get the idea. Anyway, point is that's not their concern. Their concern is making money, and they're going to do whatever they need to make money. So why on earth would they ever lower prices? Why not just raise them, right? Competition. Enter Hulu. Hulu comes in, they offer a lower price. And if Hulu also offers a better product, or at least a comparable product at a lower price, then Netflix is going to be in trouble. And so competition. Competition theoretically causes Netflix to lower their prices or increase the quality of their product. Hulu, same thing. They've got to lower their prices or do better. But what if instead companies work together? What if Hulu and Netflix and I was about to say Disney, but Disney owns Hulu, so Paramount. Let's say Paramount. What if Paramount and Disney, Hulu, whatever, Paramount and Hulu and Netflix all got together and said, guys, why don't we just all agree that we're going to charge $20 a month? What would we, the consumers, do? Go back to cable? What are we, elderly? No, I'm just joking. People got cable. But really, what would we do, right? Now imagine, of course, entertainment is something that has what we call elastic demand, meaning people, if they feel like the price is too high for something that has elastic demand, that means that they can just not buy it and they can get by, right? People don't need streaming services. People can, read a book or, they could pirate everything. But what if it was something that we do need? What if it was food? What if HEB, Kroger, and Aldi got together and all agreed to increase their prices by 30%? What would we do about it? Start growing our own food on the balcony of our apartments? I mean, you see what I'm saying? That's inelastic demand. The railroads represented inelastic demand. Everyone needed the railroads. Farmers need the railroads. Business owners need the railroads. And so the railroads got together and said, let's all agree to charge the same price. Let's all agree that, we're going to have this territory and you guys get that territory and you guys get that territory. We're not going to get any on each other's turf. It's like a gang. It's like the mafia. It's like different mafia families getting together and having, a meeting with their consiglieres and all that to come up with like how to divide their turf and get along. And that's not good for capitalism. I mean, that's good for the capitalist. It's not good for the consumers. It's not good for the workers. They could all also agree. Let's also all agree we're only going to pay so many dollars an hour. We're all going to only pay minimum wage or something, right? There was no minimum wage back then, but you get my idea. So that's why pooling's illegal, but it wasn't illegal back then, and the railroads did it and made a ton of money from it, and so did other companies, oil companies and so on. Now the trust is a different situation. The trust is actually very complicated. I'm going to explain why the trust was created in the first place, and then I'll use that to explain what the trust is. So what was going on is you have these wealthy businessmen like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, who are buying up businesses left and right. Rockefeller in particular, give him credit. He was very smart. He was also born rich because almost all rich people are born rich. It's extremely almost impossible, not quite impossible, but close to impossible to be born poor and become rich. But it happens. For instance, Carnegie was born poor and became the wealthiest man on earth for a while. Rockefeller ended up having more money than him in the long run because, well, we'll find out later. But anyway, my point is Rockefeller is rich, but he's also smart, and he's going around and buying up oil companies, little mom and pop oil companies. If you can imagine, there used to be little small business oil companies. And he's going around the country buying up oil companies, and you're like, well, I'd buy up oil companies if I had money. This is when oil was not really an expensive product. This is before cars had been invented, when oil was pretty much only used for lubrication of machinery. And if you were a farmer and you're digging a well looking for water and oil came up, you would be like, God has cursed me, right? You wouldn't be jumping for joy and moving the family to Beverly Hills, that is. That was a joke. Okay. Anyway, I assume most of you are far too young to get that joke, but I hope somebody out there got it and is laughing. Anyway, so as I was saying, so Rockefeller is going up buying up businesses, and he's starting to get toward having a monopoly, which is where he controls the market. But no one's really caring. I mean, it's not a big business anyway. And then oil really takes off. Cars are invented. Oil becomes the most profitable product on Earth, and Carnegie controls more than 50% of all the oil wells in the United States. So he's doing really well. He's making a ton of money. And state governments were like, man, this Carnegie guy, I don't like how this is happening. It wasn't just Carnegie, it was other people too. They're like, we need to pass some laws. We're going to make it illegal for a person to buy a company in this state unless they live in this state. There's only a few states that did this, but this put a bind in Carnegie's plans. And so what he did is he just started a business called Standard Oil of New Jersey. And Standard Oil of New Jersey bought the companies. And so then those states immediately are like, nope, actually, it's also illegal for an out-of-state company to buy these businesses. So then, I think I said Carnegie, I meant Rockefeller. Then Rockefeller's, and I say he, is actually his accountant, came up with a really interesting idea, which is, and by the way, this accountant that I'm mentioning went on to be the Secretary of the Treasury later on. That's cool. Anyway, he came up with the idea of using a trust. Now, in really simple legal terms, a trust is a thing that already existed for a long time and still exists today. You've heard of when somebody is a trust fund kid, right? And that's, grandpa's a millionaire. He dies when you're 10 years old. He decides to leave $50 million to you, but a 10-year-old can't have $50 million because they'll just use it to buy Pokemon cards. So instead, it's put in a trust, and you don't get that money until you turn 18 or maybe graduate college or, marry a girl or something, whatever grandpa's stipulations were for you. So the trust is this legal instrument that controls that money in this case. But a trust can be used for all sorts of things. And essentially what a trust is it's almost like you're creating a person, but they're not a person. They're a document. They're a legal document, but that document has powers that a person has, but it has all of your strengths and none of your weaknesses, right? It can conduct business. It can buy and sell things. It can invest in the stock market, but you know what it can't do? Die. And it can't go to jail. It can't get sick. It can't go crazy or anything like that. Now, of course, we don't have AI advanced enough to do this yet, right? So it has to be controlled by a person. Or if it's really big and wealthy enough, it can be controlled by a board of people, a board of trustees, which I'm sure you've heard of before. So you can see how trust is used throughout our society in all sorts of ways that are completely benign and not bad. What Rockefeller's accountant comes up with is taking that trust and having it not buy companies, because he's like, if I have the trust start buying companies, they're just going to pass another law making it illegal to buy for trust to buy companies. But what if instead that trust were to invest in the stock market and buy a controlling amount of shares in that company? So the way a corporation works, a publicly traded corporation, right? You've got stock, and people that own a substantial amount of that stock, they can vote on the board of trustees for that company. Actually, it's the same term, but it's not a trust in this case. But if you, and make decisions that way, right? But if you have 50% or more of the stock, then you just control the company. So rather than have Rockefeller control the stock, the Standard Oil Trust buys up these controlling shares of these companies. And this allows them to do all sorts of stuff. The trust can't go to jail. It can't be killed. It's kind of an immortal being that can just operate businesses and get around all these anti-monopoly laws. And Congress is going to have to pass an entire new type of law to deal with this. And they will at the end of this chapter, in fact. And they'll even call it an antitrust law. In fact, they'll pass two of them. And Standard Oil Trust will eventually be killed, actually. It will be chopped into pieces, in fact. One of those pieces is called Mobil. Another of those pieces is called Exxon. Another of the pieces, it becomes something that later changes its name to Chevron. You're starting to get what happened here. All right, but anyway, so that's pools and trust. Trusts are very complicated. I tried to just break it down as simple as I can. All right, let's talk about some wealthy billionaires, or not quite billionaires. We've got billionaires adjusted for inflation. We got Andrew Carnegie, who is briefly the richest person that has ever lived, adjusted for inflation. John D. Rockefeller will take that record from him and still holds it to this day, in fact, when we adjust for inflation. He was not a billionaire, but in today's money, he would be the wealthiest billionaire. So, sorry. Let's talk about Carnegie first. Carnegie is a unicorn. He is that 1 in a billion chance that a poor person becomes rich without, becoming like a professional sports person or something. Andrew Carnegie was a poor immigrant from Scotland, came to the United States at the age of 8 with his parents. Did not go to school at all. No public school, no private school, none of that. He got a job at 8 selling newspapers on the street. He was a newsie. A newsie. For a second, I thought I said Uzi. He was a newsie, like the Christian Bale movie. But at the age of 12, he gets hired by the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. When you play Monopoly, and there's the 4 railroads, short line, Reading is spelled reading, it's pronounced Reading. B&O, which is Baltimore and Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania Railroad. He gets hired by them to be a messenger boy. He sits in their telegraph office because synergy, right? The railroads also controlled the telegraph. This is before telephone had been invented. This is like 1840s, 50s, like late 1840s, early 1850s. I don't really remember when Carnegie was born. Not really important. I said it wasn't important, and then I went and looked it up. He was born in 1835, so at the age of 12 would be 1847. Telegraph became widely available in 1845. So my math checks out. Anyway, though I still could be wrong. I might have his age wrong or something. Anyway, so he got a job working in the telegraph office as a messenger boy. He would sit in the office. Telegrams would come in. Telegraph operator would translate them from Morse code into English, type them out or write them down, whatever, and then say, "Boy, go to Clark Street and give this to Mr. Pennybacker and hurry about it." And he'd be, "Yes, sir." And he'd take it and he'd run across town. Maybe, no, he didn't have a horse. Maybe he had a bike. Probably not. Those were barely a thing. Probably actually not a thing at all yet. So he'd run across town, hand deliver the message. But he's super smart. So he would read the messages. And while the messages were coming in, here they're like beep, 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 all that. He would hear it, memorize it, and kind of reverse engineer, teach himself Morse code. So he taught himself Morse code just from reading these messages. He also made sure he was very charismatic. He made sure to befriend all of these wealthy, powerful men in Philadelphia. And he makes good connections. By age 16, he's now the telegraph operator. And at 18, he is the superintendent of the Philadelphia office of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which is the person in charge of all operations in Philadelphia for Pennsylvania Railroad, which is one of the biggest railroads in the country, one of the biggest railroad companies there is. And then he works his way up to that and is eventually a vice president in the company. And then the Civil War starts. And the owner of the Pennsylvania Railroad, who's friends of Abraham Lincoln, because rich people and politicians, even good ones we really like, they're just like this, right? Gets him in as the person in charge of operating the railroads for the Union Army. He makes lots of good political and business connections in this role. And he also makes some good money. Gets out, the war's over. He leaves that job. And a bunch of the wealthy, powerful friends of his give him some stock tips, some insider trading tips, but that wasn't illegal back then. He invests his money in the stock market, makes more money, takes that money, invests in real estate, makes more money, and then he starts getting into the steel industry. And he becomes a pioneer of something we call vertical integration. So vertical integration, there's a hypothetical version of it right here on the left. But I'm gonna actually use Carnegie's actual one. So vertical integration is when a company or whatever trust person, whatever, owns not just their company, but they own the different steps in the production of their product and distribution of the product. So we'll use this hypothetical. We have Ace Meat Industries. Now, Ace Meat Industries could just be the company that sells meat to grocery stores, right? A company that sells meat to grocery stores. But the way they outcompete their competitors is they don't just own the company that makes the meat. They own the ranches where the cattle are raised. They own the slaughterhouses where the cattle are slaughtered. They own the refrigerated railroad cars that the slaughtered meat is transported on. They own the cold warehouses that it's stored in. They own the meat packing plants where the meat is processed. And they own the delivery wagons that delivers the meat to the grocery stores. And so at every step of the process, they have cut the middleman out of the operation. Other companies, they're buying their meat directly from a meat packing plant. Meat packing plants are buying their meat from slaughterhouses. Slaughterhouses are buying the meat that they process from a rancher. But Ace Meat Industries, our hypothetical company, they've bought up all this stuff, so they don't have to pay a rancher. They own the ranch. They don't have to pay a slaughterhouse. They own the slaughterhouse. They don't have to pay a railroad. They do have to pay the railroad company, but maybe they could own the railroad too. Carnegie did this, right? Carnegie owned iron mines where iron ore was mined. He owned coal mines where coal was mined. He owned a fleet of ships that transported iron ore from his mines in Michigan to a railroad in Iowa. He owned the railroad in Iowa that transported the iron ore from Iowa to Pennsylvania. He owned the steel plants that made the steel. That's the main thing that he owns, right? He owned railroads that transported that steel to the markets on the East Coast. And then he owned construction companies on the East Coast that bought his own company's steel to do construction projects. So his construction company can drastically undercharge every other competitor and get all the juicy contracts. They can overpay for the steel if they, on top of that. And so it just completely cuts out the competition. And it's actually totally legal as long as you don't gain a monopoly from it. But the thing about it is again, first of all, those laws didn't exist yet. And secondly, they are haphazardly enforced, right? You think of Disney, for instance, right? Disney really took a big step by starting the Disney Channel back in the 1980s. So, or late 80s, early 90s, late 80s. Disney, up to that point, they were a content creator primarily. They made art. They made movies. They made animated and live action movies. And then those movies were played on television stations and played in theaters. And Disney decided they couldn't cut out the theaters because back in the 1930s, 1920s, Congress passed a law that production companies can't own theaters, and vice versa. But they never did anything about TV. So Disney started the Disney Channel. And this was revolutionary, right? And, then with streaming, you got the same idea, right? Netflix produces a lot of their own shows. Disney Plus makes all their content. Paramount Plus is playing all this Paramount stuff. And that's vertical integration right there. So anyway, now a pioneer of horizontal integration we've already talked about, and that is our good buddy John D. Rockefeller here. So Rockefeller, he didn't really pioneer, but he's most famous for horizontal integration, which is what he was doing at the beginning of that story earlier, buying up other oil companies, right? So an oil company buying up other oil companies is horizontal integration, or horizontal expansion, I believe is actually what your book calls it. And is what I called it on the study guide. Yes, horizontal expansion. Disney buying Fox is an example of horizontal expansion or horizontal integration. Disney starting Disney Plus to distribute their entertainment products is vertical. Okay. Anyway, you may remember this if you went to high school in the United States. You may remember this vaguely. This is kind of like stuff that you learned in high school also. All right, let's move on. We're going to kind of skip ahead a little bit. We're going to talk about people. We need a little dose of niceness. So we'll talk about Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis was a crime scene photographer who noticed that the crime scenes that he got called were to photograph, grisly murders and suicides and so on, happened to be in just the most ridiculously, abjectly impoverished areas of New York. Places that he felt certain the average New Yorker on the other side of town had no idea existed. So he went to New York's Lower East Side, where literally a third of the population of the city lived in a tiny little piece of the city. And he walked around and he photographed the living conditions of poor immigrants, and mostly immigrants, in New York City. And he called it How the Other Half Lives. And so he would go to, fancy rich person parties. He'd get invited to the fancy rich people parties because fancy rich people, a lot of them actually want to do good with their money to an extent. And a lot of them just want to appear to do good with their money. And a lot of them just, that's kind of, they either want to do good or they want to appear to do good. Either way, we call this philanthropy, right? And so they would invite him to their parties and he would show this slideshow. They called it a magic lantern show because you literally used a lantern to project the film negatives onto a wall. But he would do this magic lantern show called How the Other Half Lives. And then, I guess presumably people would write him checks or something. But so you can see these horrible living conditions that these poor immigrants are living in. And yeah, the average wealthy or even middle class person in New York City probably had no idea that anyone was actually living this way. All right, I'm going to move along. So just the idea is that there are some good people there. All right, next up, I want to talk about two different ideologies. Your study guide, they're not listed together, actually. So we're going to talk about the Gospel of Wealth, which actually is on your study guide. It's just with Andrew Carnegie. It's also, there's an excerpt of it in your first, I believe your first Voices of Freedom assignment is an excerpt from the Gospel of Wealth. So we're going to talk about the Gospel of Wealth as opposed to basically its exact opposite, social Darwinism. So Andrew Carnegie had this epiphany at some point, I guess. He's this insanely wealthy person. He's done some sneaky, underhanded stuff, some union busting, some straight up had mercenaries straight up murder union workers to stop unions from organizing at his steel plants. So not a good guy at all, done bad stuff, but he has this epiphany and he writes this essay called The Gospel of Wealth. It's often published. It was originally published under the title Wealth, and then it was later renamed The Gospel of Wealth, to be a little precise. And basically he said the wealthy must not think of their wealth as their own wealth. They must instead see themselves as trustees put in charge of administering society's wealth. And that wealthy people have a moral duty to society to help the poor. He was against direct charity because he believed that direct charity would just teach people to be lazy and dependent. Instead, he believed that the wealthy should use their money to improve society through the building of schools, public schools, museums, libraries, concert halls, the creation of trade schools and low-cost colleges and universities, scholarship programs, parks, public parks, things like that. Things that would help the poor to enrich themselves, both in terms of education, job skills, and just culturally enrich themselves. And this led to a widespread, extensive philanthropy among American businessmen. And by the time Carnegie died, he had given away something in the neighborhood of like 70% of all of his money. That's why he doesn't hold the record for being the richest man ever, because he started giving away all of his money. So yeah, that is it. On the other hand, we have basically the exact opposite. If it's possible to be any more anti-gospel of wealth, it's social Darwinism, which first of all has nothing at all to do with Charles Darwin. In fact, when he was questioned about the rise of social Darwinism, he was horrified at the idea that his name was being associated with something so vile. So what is it? It's this philosophy promoted by conservative sociologist Herbert Spencer, William Graham Sumner, Thomas Malthus, Francis Galton, and others. Primarily, it's Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner, who were kind of the... Herbert Spencer started it in England. Sumner brought it to America. But basically, if you've ever heard the phrase survival of the fittest, you probably think that's from something Darwin wrote. You probably think it's from Darwin's book on evolution called The Origin of Species. But Darwin actually did not ever talk about survival of the fittest. Darwin talked about adaptation, right? Which is not the same thing, because, in nature, species don't necessarily adapt to be the fittest for survival. They adapt for all manner of reasons, some of which don't make them super fit for survival. Some of which, but mostly it's more to be the fittest for reproduction, typically. But there could be other factors that cause them to adapt in different ways. The idea of survival of the fittest that term is coined by Herbert Spencer. And his idea was you should not help the poor in any way. And that's not just you, right? You and me, wealthy, he's not just saying wealthy people don't help the poor. He's also saying the government, don't tax the wealthy, don't tax businesses, don't regulate them. Let rich people do their thing. Let businesses do their thing, and let poor people do theirs. Because if you aren't supposed to be poor, you won't be. And if you're supposed to be rich, you will be. And helping the poor, according to Spencer, you're messing with science. You're messing with the natural order of things. The poor will either adapt and do better and not be poor, or they'll die. But we shouldn't get involved. And he argues, you don't need to regulate businesses. If a business is good, it'll succeed. If a business is bad, it'll fail. It'll all balance itself out. So they're opposed to taxes, any kind of help for the poor, any kind of charity, be it philanthropy like Carnegie was calling for, or straight up just, direct charity. He's against all that. The closest ideology in today's society to this is libertarianism, but hashtag not all libertarians. To be clear, many libertarians are very much in favor of charity. They're just not in favor of the government forcing any kind of charity through taxes, through social programs, through government programs that help poor people. But that doesn't, they're not necessarily opposed to private charity. Now, what do the gospel of wealth and social Darwinism are very opposites, obviously, but they do have a couple of things in common. They both are opposed to direct charity. They're opposed to welfare programs. I ran out of room in the green there, but they're opposed to taxes. They're both opposed to regulation on businesses. And they're both based upon the idea that rich people are just better than poor people. Straight up. They're just better. So, all right. We're going to move on now. I want to briefly talk about a couple of Supreme Court cases here. We've got Munn versus Illinois and Wabash versus Illinois. So Munn versus Illinois is a Supreme Court case that upheld the ability of states to regulate the railroads, which then implies that states could also potentially regulate other businesses, not all businesses, but that they could regulate specific kinds of businesses, such as the railroad, which is a business created for the public good. Well, it's not created for the public good, but which was financed by the government for the public good. So that's Munn versus Illinois. That's the Supreme Court case. 20 years later, we get Wabash versus Illinois, which overturns that and says, no, the states can't do that. The justification in Wabash is that railroads engage in interstate commerce, that is, business between the states. And Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution says that Congress may regulate trade between the states. And that means, per the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, states cannot do that. So, boom. Anyway, so that's Munn versus Illinois and Wabash versus Illinois. Next up, we've got United States versus E.C. Knight Company. And with that one, this was against a sugar company. I guess it's the E.C. Knight Sugar Company. And anyway, the deal was that the Supreme Court ruled that the federal government cannot regulate monopolies in manufacturing. They can't regulate manufacturing, period. That it would have to be left up to the states. Now, later, like a lot later, there was another Supreme Court case. No, not a lot later, 10 years later. 10 years later, there's another Supreme Court case where they say, oh, okay, they can if the products are being sold across state lines. So back to that interstate commerce thing. But anyway, all right, I'm going to skip over the Great Railroad Strike. There's a big railroad strike. Well, no, I don't have to skip over it. I could talk about the Great Railroad Strike, actually. So the Great Railroad Strike, there's actually a couple of strikes in U.S. history called the Great Railroad Strike. We're talking about the one in 1877. I had to go look up the date. And this one is basically the B&O Railroad from Monopoly, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which is, interestingly enough, way back in the 1830s, became the first commercial railroad ever. But anyway, they cut wages like multiple times over the course of like a year, I think 3 times in a year. So the workers went on strike without a union, and they were violently put down by the state National Guard militias. They weren't called National Guard yet. State militias, federal troops, I believe, were sent in. There were just like vigilante gangs organized by politicians or by the business that went in, and like over 100 people were killed. And all the workers ended up being fired. It was bad times. Now, the Knights of Labor is our first real labor union. So I've got this little chart here with 3 famous labor unions. The National Labor Union, we're not really talking about. The first real like national union that actually like did anything were the Knights of Labor. They're formed in 1869. They, by 1886, represented 20% of all workers in the United States. Their big thing they were pushing for was the 8-hour workday. There's other stuff they called for, but they were pushing for an 8-hour workday. They rejected socialism and anarchy, but they allowed diverse workers, blacks, women, Catholics, etc. I believe they did specifically ban Chinese workers, and they banned blacks in the South. But anyway, still, it's something. They fell apart due to unfair accusations of violence, as well as an economic depression, making unions less popular. But for the little bit, the Knights of Labor, they're kind of it. They're kind of the thing as far as a national union goes. Let's see, just looking through my study guide, see what we have next. Got a lot of stuff to go. All right, so we got let's see. I'm gonna go ahead and skip ahead a good bit. and talk about the social gospel, which I don't have a good picture for, I don't think. Not really. I'll put it on this. I'm gonna put it on this communism caterpillar. Uh, no, I'll put it on here. Oh, here, yeah, here we go. I've got the founders of it. All right. So the social gospel, not to be confused with the gospel of wealth, not to be confused with social Darwinism. Social gospel is this crazy idea that Christians have a moral duty to help the poor and to benefit society at large. And I'm sorry I said that sarcastically, but like I think most Christians would argue that yeah, that's kind of what they're supposed to do, right? But not everybody was on board with it back then. So on the left we have Washington Gladden. He's a minister in the American Congregational Church, which are descendants but very different from the Puritans. Then we got Walter Rosenbush, a Baptist minister from Hell's Kitchen, New York City. And they are both, Gladden is kind of seen as the father of the movement. Rauschenbusch is seen as like kind of its most important early. Uh, I was trying to think of the word for it. Uh, Person that pushed it. I don't acolyte. I was gonna say propagandist. It's not propaganda. I was gonna say pushing it. Well, it's not pushing. Anyway, him. He's their most famous one. And anyway, what it comes down to is basically the idea that Christians have a moral duty to help society, and that doesn't just mean putting money in the collection plate. That it means going out into communities, helping the poor. It means protesting for workers' rights, protesting for union rights, protesting for immigrant rights, protesting for higher wages. Meeting with congressmen and calling for them to push these things, and state legislators and governors. So it's a very socially aware Christianity, very aware of that they live in a society and that they need to help benefit that society. So that's the social gospel, and it does a lot of good stuff. As with any good thing, sometimes people take it in a bad direction. A good example of that is the Mann Act. There was a honestly make-believe problem of human trafficking. Human trafficking really was not as big a thing as people thought it was. The idea that people had, perpetuated by the media, was that, well, you can see it in the thing there, 60,000 girls a year who would be converted into white slaves, which means they're going to be kidnapped and forced into prostitution, basically. And first of all, if it's happening, it's not going to just be happening to white girls, yet people called it white slavery. So there's a racial thing going on. But anyway, social gospel people kind of latched onto this and really pushed a solution to it, or solutions to it. The problem is it wasn't actually a thing. It was not happening. That's just was not a thing. But people thought it was. And so they created these laws to regulate it, to stop it, not regulate it, to get rid of it. The most famous one being the Mann Act, aka the White Slave Traffic Act. Mann is spelled with two N's. It's a guy that wrote the law. But this is a federal law that makes it a federal crime to, quote, transport a woman across state lines for immoral purposes. This law, still, end quote. This law, still on the books, has been used somewhat recently. There is a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from Florida named Matt Gaetz. He is accused of having sex with underage girls. He, I believe, does not dispute the sex. He just disputes that they were underage. But those girls, at least two of them, were transported across state lines when they were allegedly under 18. And it's alleged that he's the one who moved them. And so the investigation is looking at possibly charging him under the Mann Act. He has denied the allegations, says that he didn't have anything to do with that. But anyway, I'm not saying he did or didn't. I'm saying that's a current example of how it's still in the books. And if he's guilty of that, then that's a good use of it, right? but it has often historically not been used for a good reason. Instead, we have this story over here, Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson was the black heavyweight champion of the world because this is when boxing was segregated. And he had a habit that the general white audience of the United States was not a fan of, which is talking a lot of smack to white boxers. He also liked to date white women. And so he ended up dating a white woman and getting married to her. They got married in New York, where interracial marriage was legal. They then drove across state lines to Atlantic City, New Jersey, for their honeymoon. And New Jersey, by the way, interracial marriage was legal there too. It was still illegal in 16 states, including ours, but it was legal there. But state police officers stopped them on the way into Atlantic City and arrested Jack Johnson for violation of the Mann Act. They claimed that his wife was actually not his wife. She was a prostitute. She had some children. The police threatened to kill her children, or not kill them, to take them away and put them in orphanages if she did not testify on the stand that she was in fact a prostitute and that Jack Johnson just had bought her. And so he was found guilty and sentenced to prison for violation of the Mann Act. Now, he did not actually go to jail. He escaped the country and moved to France for several years. He eventually came back in exchange for pleading guilty and paying a fine. So he did, so he could come back to the U.S. A few years later, he married another white woman, and exactly the same thing happened, and this time he did go to jail. So anyway, why does that have to do with the social gospel? The social gospel also includes pushing these kind of morality laws like this, some of which are good, some of which maybe not, and sometimes even the good ones can be used for not good purposes, as we see here. So, though that is definitely not the social gospel's intention. All right, well, now we're going to just switch gear. I'm going to switch gears, just super duper switch gears, and we're going to talk about the, I'm just going to kind of really just skip straight to the genocide of the Native Americans on the Plains Indians by the U.S. military and other groups. So they talked here about, for instance, Grant's peace policy. So prior to President Ulysses S. Grant, the federal government had, over time, rounded up Native Americans and forced them on to smaller and smaller let's not call them concentration camps. Let's call them reservations, because that's what the federal government called them. They're not concentration camps. They're more akin to the ghettos. Point is, taking a group of people and concentrating them in a place they don't want to be and not letting them leave, whatever you want to call that. We call it reservations in America. So they had been doing that periodically, going back to, before the United States. The colonists of Virginia did this to the Wampanoag Indians in 1624, right? So the reservation system is a very tried and true American tradition. Anyway, this, on the reservations, natives had been just completely administered and regulated and policed by U.S. Army. And this constantly caused lots of issues, lots of violence. So Grant, in his State of the Union address in 1871, see, 71? See, so Lincoln's 60, 64, and then, yeah, 70, I think, I need to look it up. I believe it's 71. He was I was getting mixed up. I was like, no, he wasn't inaugurated in 71. He was inaugurated in 69. But State of the Union is not inauguration. Anyway, all right. In his State of the Union address, he said, we need to adopt, basically that we need to adopt a more peaceful strategy toward natives. He says we've already started doing this and it's been very successful. And really what he talks about is assimilation. Assimilation being, and you can look a couple of items down on the study guide, we have federal efforts at forced assimilation. But the idea of assimilation is when a group, a minority group, be they immigrants or Native Americans, are either forced or coerced or persuaded, whatever, influenced, however, to leave behind at least some of their culture and adopt the culture of the dominant majority group. And so Grant is saying we need to focus on assimilation, assimilating them into white American Christian society, specifically. Very specifically, those things. Make them like us, economically, socially, and religiously. And then, that'll result in a more peaceful situation. And so he's going to really push pulling soldiers off the reservations, except for small forces to police them, and instead bringing in churches, bringing in Protestants and Catholics, religious groups, as well as civilian employees to deal with the natives and push conversion, conversion, but push assimilation. So that's Grant's peace policy. Now, ultimately, how did his peace policy go? It ultimately, it doesn't really work. It doesn't really last because the natives, they don't all want to assimilate. They don't want to be Christian. They don't want to give up their culture. They don't want to give up their language. They don't want to give up their way of life. And when they refuse to abide, then that's when the military comes out, and then there's massacres and genocide and warfare. And so ultimately, his peace policy really just does not end up working out in the long run. And in fact, assimilation is not going to go away. It's just going to become more forced. So kind of the event that is seen as the death of Grant's peace policy is the Battle of Little Bighorn. And I wanted to, rather than just talk about, you listening to a mostly white, half white man, I'm Hispanic, but we'll say for all intents and purposes, a white man say what they felt. I'm going to read some of their words. I like to do that. So first we have here Chief Joseph, which is a name he adopted because the whites could not pronounce his actual name. His name was Hinmatan Yalaktit, that's how it's spelled. It's actually pronounced. I'm sorry, Hinmatuyalatkit, Hinmatuyalatkit, which means thunder rolling down the mountain. He was the principal leader of the Nez Perce Indians, natives, which, by the way, Nez Perce, not their name. So many of the native groups we talk about today use a name that was given to them by whites without their input. In the case of the Nez Perce, that is French for pierced nose. When the French first encountered the Nez Perce, many of them had pierced noses, and so the French, rather than bother to actually learn the name of their group, instead just called them the Nez Perce. In the same way that when a French explorer asked his native guide, "Who are those people over there?" his native guide said, "Enemy. They're enemies." But he said it in his language, and in his language, the word for enemy was Sioux. And that French guy wrote down the word Sioux the way a French person would spell it, S-I-O-U-X, and that's still what we call them today. Similarly, when the French leader Samuel de Champlain was talking with his friendly Huron allies, and they said they wanted to help fighting their enemies, and he asked who their enemies were, and the Huron leader said, "They're just a bunch of snakes." His word in his language for snakes was Iroquois. Champlain wrote down Iroquois, and we still call them the Iroquois today, even though they are the Hananahonse, which is the Great League of Peace. But anyway. All right, so what does Chief Joseph have to say? Perhaps you think the Creator sent you here to dispose of us as you see fit. If I thought you were sent by the Creator, I might be induced to think you had a right to dispose of me. Do not misunderstand me, but understand fully with reference to my affection for the land. I never said the land was mine to do with as I choose. The one who has a right to dispose of it is the one who has created it. I claim a right to live on my land and accord you the privilege to return to yours. So I love that. I'm going to give you a chance to walk away, get out of here. Eventually, 3 years of fighting, his people starving, he speaks again to the Americans and he says, "Let me be a free man, free to travel, free to stop, free to work, free to trade where I choose, free to choose my own teachers, free to follow the religion of my fathers, free to talk, think, and act for myself, and I will obey every law or submit to the penalty." A couple of years later, he officially surrenders his people to go live on a reservation. So many of them have died at this point. And he says, from here until the sun set, and from here until where the sun sets, I will fight no more forever. This is kind of most famous quote, but I didn't write that one down. All right, now this is another leader in the same general geographic area. We're talking about the northern Great Plains. We're talking North Dakota, Montana, southern Canada. And there are a large distribution of over 40 different tribal groups in this area. They are commonly referred to as the Sioux. They do not call themselves that. They have all sorts of names for each other, but all of them speak a common language that they call Lakota. So typically historians refer to them as the Lakota or the Lakota Sioux. Anyway, a Lakota Sioux leader, the most famous of all of them, is this guy right here, Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull was more of a what do you call a peace leader or a spiritual leader. He was not a spiritual. He was a chieftain of one group, of one village, who was appointed to speak and lead on behalf of all of the different groups that were, all the different villages in several different groups in time of peace. But in time of war, they picked a different guy to be the war chief, and that was a guy named Crazy Horse. There were other war chiefs as well. Crazy Horse was just the chief among the war chiefs. There was Red Horse, and I honestly don't know all of them. But anyway, and so Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse worked together to fight against the U.S. military, because the U.S. military had basically declared all-out war on any natives not on the reservations. So if you're on the reservations, Grant's peace policy was still in effect, but not on the reservations. There was a full-on war against the Plains Indians. This war was led by U.S. military general, Union War veteran Philip T. Sheridan. And Sheridan he issued a field order to his men to wipe out the buffalo, make the buffalo go extinct, completely extinct. And so his thought was the Plains Indians rely upon the buffalo utterly for their entire way of life. So if we destroy the buffalo utterly, then the Plains Indians will have no choice but to surrender to us or die. And so they went about eradicating the buffalo, and they were very successful, though not 100% successful. The buffalo, a small number of them managed to survive, and thanks to modern conservation, they are thriving in captivity. But still, it was very effective. And so the Lakota Sioux, a large group of them under Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, declared war on the U.S. military. And this war was fought in the Great Plains, until a final important decisive battle known as the Battle of Little Bighorn, otherwise known as Custer's Last Stand, where General George Armstrong Custer foolishly led a small force, just his cavalry, into an ambush where he and all 200 something of his men were killed. And this is important as the very last time that natives were ever really successful against the U.S. military. It's also important as the end of Grant's peace policy. Um, Basically, after this, the federal government is not interested in being peaceful with them. It's going to be genocide. I mean, it's basically going to be live under prison camp like conditions in abject poverty on the reservations or face genocide. So, yeah. So, anyway, the federal government continues to push assimilation. The primary method they use for this is the building of what are called the Indian schools. These were federally funded boarding schools run mostly by Christian churches, where native children would be forced to assimilate. We have a picture here, two pictures here, demonstrating the methodology of the boarding schools. Carlisle is the Carlisle School in, oh, I want to say it's Western Pennsylvania, but it might be Illinois. I forget. Was kind of the biggest and most famous of these. The last one to still be in it was still in operation into the mid 20th century. But anyway, uh, so native children would be kidnapped and forced to live at these, or their parents would be forced through various means to give them up to it. And of course, orphans would also be taken, and they would be forced to assimilate, as you can see here. And their culture stripped from them. The conditions at these schools were very harsh, a lot of physical abuse, also a lot of rampant sexual abuse at these schools by the Christian missionaries operating them. Though that stuff was not well known back then, it's come out more recently. And thousands of the children were murdered at the schools as well. These schools were also operated in Canada by the Canadian government. We know more about the abuse and stuff in Canada because the Canadian government has been much more interested in actually doing something about it now, learning about it, making reparations, etc., than the U.S. government has been. So, but we know it was happening in both places. Anyway, another methodology of the assimilation was the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act was a federal law that attempted to coerce natives into assimilating by essentially taking tribal land away from the tribe, dividing it up into family farms, and then giving it away to the Native American men in exchange for assimilation. They assimilate, they send their kids to the boarding schools, they do, jump through various hoops to prove that they're being good Indians, that they've assimilated to white American Christian culture. And if they do this, then after 5 years, the land is theirs. For a number of reasons, this ends up in taking the land away from the Native Americans. And I have a number here I wrote down in my notes if I can find it. Where's my Dawes Act number? Within 50 years of the Dawes Act being in effect, natives lost 86 million out of 138 million acres of land that they had before the Dawes Act. So, yeah. Because, if they take the native land and they divide it up and only, only like 50% of the natives volunteer to take them up on their deal and agree to it, then the rest of that land just goes up for auction. Or if a lot of the land was good for things like building a railroad, good for mining, but not good for farming, but they would force them, no, you have to farm, and you have to farm the way white Americans farm. And if you don't do that, then you lose the land. And so a lot of them would lose the land because of that, or they would be forced to sell it after they got it. And so the result is, out of 138 million acres, 86 million ends up in non-native hands within 50 years. So, all right. Elk versus Wilkins Supreme Court case. Supreme Court ruled that the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution do not apply to natives. So the 14th Amendment, among other things, states that people born in the United States are automatically U.S. citizens. So whatever the circumstances of your birth may be, if you're born in the U.S., you're a citizen. Full stop. Doesn't matter what your parents were, anything else. The 15th Amendment says that you cannot deny someone the right to vote on account of their race. And so the Supreme Court in Elk versus Wilkins ruled, yeah, but not Native Americans. They're not citizens and they can't vote. So, done. But some did become citizens and gain the right to vote. By 1900, 53,000 Native Americans gained citizenship through the Dawes Act. When the Oklahoma Territory became a state, the 100,000 Native Americans living there were given citizenship. During World War I, Native Americans who volunteered for the military were granted citizenship after the war. So, there were natives getting citizenship, but it's a drop in the bucket of their total population. They do not finally get actual citizenship until the Indian Citizenship Act of 1928. Yeah. So, anyway. All right, well, let's talk about some more bad stuff. We got the ghost dance. The ghost dance was a kind of religious revival, kind of a cult thing that took place on some of the Plains Indian reservations among the Lakota Sioux in 1890. And essentially what was going on here is there was this religious craze spreading through the reservations where people did this dance called the ghost dance. And the idea of the ghost dance is that it would speak to the ghost of the dead Native Americans and the dead buffalo and help bring them back to life. And that they would be bulletproof to white man's bullets. The U.S. Army found the popularity of this very alarming. And so they decided we need to do something about this, need to nip this in the bud before it gets too big. Who's the one causing all this? They decide it's Sitting Bull is the one who's causing all this. That's what they decide. And so, back to our picture of Sitting Bull. So they decide Sitting Bull, he must be behind it. And they go and arrest Sitting Bull. And when you know it, he dies in police custody or U.S. military custody. This causes the members of his village that he was a chief of basically a refugee village of Lakota Sioux that are all survivors. They're almost all elderly or children, orphans of the war with the U.S. military. And they run away from the reservation and they end up at a place called Wounded Knee Creek. Now, at this time, the want to make sure I get it right. I mean, honestly, I believe the Republicans are in power. Yeah, it's a Republican president, and the Democrats controlled Congress. Yeah, so the Republican president, Benjamin Harrison. Yeah, I looked it up. Republican president, Benjamin Harris, Democrat controlled Congress. Democrats in Congress have been calling out Harrison in the press, saying that he's being too soft on the natives. Saying that he's just being too soft on the natives. The Republicans are too soft on the natives. They need to toughen up on them. And so when this happens, Harrison decides, all right, I'll show you tough. And so to deal with the 500 or so Native Americans who are mostly, again, elderly people and children, he sends 9,000 U.S. soldiers, mostly militia. The soldiers are themselves armed, fully armed, but also along with their normal armaments, they have 3 of a brand new, pretty new invention called the machine gun. And it's a still mechanical crank machine gun like the Gatling gun you may have heard of before. And so they get there, and one thing leads to another, and they open fire on the village, killing over 300 mostly unarmed Native Americans. And this is known as the Wounded Knee Massacre. Or, if you're a public high school student in the state of Texas, it's known as the Battle of Wounded Knee. Yeah. Anyway, so this is the Wounded Knee Massacre. It is one of, but somehow not the worst massacre of Native Americans in all of U.S. history. And it stands as important as the very last time Native Americans would ever resist the U.S. government until literally 1969, when armed Native Americans, took over Wounded Knee Creek Visitor Center and Alcatraz Island temporarily. Wounded Knee for all of 2 days, and Alcatraz for like 6 months, actually. But you know what? We'll learn about that in a few weeks. Let's completely and utterly switch gears. I gotta say, this book, chapter 16, really gives you whiplash. It's like, all right, Gilded Age stuff, factories, unions, Jacob Riis, communism, scary. And then it's like, all right, great, life on the Great Plains. Look at that, cornucopias, buffalo, Native Americans. And now it's like, all right, anyway, back to the Gilded Age. Another important aspect of the Gilded Age is the just absolute political corruption. And I want to take a second to draw attention to my favorite political cartoon of all time. This is called The Bosses of the Senate. This appeared in a progressive, we might today use the word liberal, but that's not really a correct attribution, progressive magazine, Puck, in January 1889. And what we have here is we have Congress seated at desk looking kind of like children in school. And behind them are the actual bosses of the Senate. The Steel Beam Trust, the Copper Trust, Standard Oil Trust, the Iron Trust, the Sugar Trust, the Tin Trust, the Coal Trust, the Paper Bag Trust, Envelope Trust. There's an Envelope Trust, the Salt Trust, the Nail Trust, the Something Steel Trust. And it says entrance for monopolist right here. Big open entrance for these guys, by the way, they're supposed to be bags of money. Except for Standard Oil, he's both a bag of money and an oil barrel. But they're bags, so they're like big bag of money, like mutant people, right? Fancy, rich bags of money. Well, that goes without saying, right? They're bags of money. And so their entrance, which says entrance for monopolist, is huge. The people's entrance is on the second floor. It's a tiny little door. And it's a closed sign. It's barred and locked with a padlock. And there's no stairs getting up to it. So that's the people's entrance. And it says, this is the Senate of the monopolist, by the monopolist, and for the monopolist. That is a reference to Abraham Lincoln, Gettysburg Address, a nation of the people, by the people, and for the people. So anyway, I love this because this is what I call an evergreen cartoon. And what I mean by that is this cartoon was extremely relevant and I would argue accurate in 1889. And I would say it's very, very relevant and accurate in 2024. So, or whatever year you're watching this, because I hopefully can reuse this video next year. But it's definitely 2024 when I'm recording it. So yeah, anyway, I just thought that was interesting. Let's talk about political machines, another topic that students often struggle to understand. Political machine, the first thing you have to understand is the word machine. We use it to mean a device that does a thing, right? A gear, a can opener, maybe. Well, that's a tool. A generator, an electric generator. That's a machine, right? But machine in English is actually any assembly of parts that does a task, that works together to do a task. And so you could have a machine that's made up of people. And a political machine is a machine made up of people. And the people in this machine are not necessarily elected officials. They're not necessarily government employees. Some of them are, some of them aren't. Its closest analogy would be the mob, the mafia, a gang, but usually without the violence. So not all, well, actually, no, not with less violence. Let's say less violence, not no violence, just less violence. Sometimes no violence. And the way a political machine works is they control the government. They control politics. They control elections. So the most famous political machine in U.S. history was the political machine known as Tammany Hall. Its boss for most of its life was this guy, William Tweed, known as Boss Tweed. He's the leader of Tammany Hall. It's called Tammany Hall, by the way, because Boss Tweed owns a gentleman's club. which is not necessarily a strip club. It's more of like a bar where only men are allowed. And also there's probably definitely prostitutes and strippers, but it's not necessarily a strip club. Anyway, he owned a gentleman's club called Tammany Hall, and that was what he used as his headquarters for the Tammany Hall political machine. And he would control everything. He owned construction companies, or had friends that owned construction companies. He would ingratiate himself to the working class, to the voters, and he would basically control who does and does not get elected, right down to having the officials who count the votes be on his payroll. And so that political cartoon there says, as long as I count the votes, what are you going to do about it? Say, I don't know if that's how he talked, but anyway, and yeah, so he basically controlled politics in the state of New York, and especially New York City, for 3 decades. Eventually, a hardworking investigative journalist was able to put together a case against him and kind of publicly shame prosecutors into actually prosecuting him. And he went to prison and died of syphilis at Rikers Island. So, hooray. But for at least 30 years, he absolutely controls everything through corruption, through bribes, kickbacks, patronage, which is giving favors to your friends once you're in office, things like that. And so, yeah, and that is political machines. Political machine is just that whole system that does all that, led by a boss. All right. Next up, we have the Crédit Mobilier scandal. The I don't know if I have a picture for the Crédit Mobilier scandal. Oh yeah, this is a political cartoon about it. Okay. It says Uncle Sam directs Vice President Schuyler Colfax and members of the U.S. Congress disgraced by their involvement in the Crédit Mobilier scandal to commit harikari ritual suicide. So it's racist too. Cool. Carl Schurz and Charles Sumner peer out from behind a screen. Oh, Charles Sumner. I didn't know he was still alive at this point. Crazy. He was beaten nearly to death on the floor of the U.S. Senate for criticizing slavery back in 1858. So he had to be pretty old by then. And he, did all right. He's all right. Anyway, I'm sorry. Let's move on. Let's get this thing done. Crédit Mobilier scandal is just a scandal involving the railroads, basically Union Pacific or Central Pacific. I forget which one. They were building the railroad and they told Congress, so like, hey, we actually need to hire a construction company to do some extra work. And we found this French construction company we want to use called Crédit Mobilier. So here's the bill. And then Congress was like, sure, we'll pay the bill, because the Vice President of the United States and members of Congress were taking bribes from Union Pacific Railroad or Central Pacific, whichever one it is, to do whatever they said. And then, hey, guess what? Turns out Crédit Mobilier, not a real company. It was just a way for the already insanely wealthy railroads, who are running the most crazy scam on the U.S. anyway, decide, but we could have even more money. And they do this. So anyway, kind of considered to be the biggest scandal in the U.S. until the next biggest scandal in the U.S. And the next item I'm talking about is politics of dead center. And the idea with the politics of dead center is basically just this idea that Republicans control the North and the West, Democrats control the South completely, and Congress basically gets nothing done. There's only brief periods during this time where the White House where one party controls both the White House and both houses of Congress. And basically nothing is getting done except for stuff that both parties agree to, which is, let's make sure to help big business be rich and do better than they're already doing. So, man, if that doesn't sound familiar to you, I'm guessing you haven't been no, I don't know. Maybe it doesn't sound familiar for other reasons. Anyway, let's move on. Blah, 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 blah. We're going to see the Civil Service Act. I don't have a picture, so we'll just leave it on. Poor James Garfield and Chester A. Arthur and his legendary sideburns. All right. So basically, James Garfield is running for re-election, and he is elected. And this guy named Charles Godot, while Garfield is running for election or re-election, I forget which one. I think it was re-election. Yeah, maybe. Anyway. So while Garfield is running for election or re-election, Charles Godot gives some crazy unhinged person speeches in his favor. Standing on a crate on street corners, screaming at people as they go by about why they need to vote for Garfield. And then Garfield wins. And so obviously Charles Godot's like, well, time for me to get my reward. And so he goes to the White House and he's like, I'd love to speak to the president, please. And they're like, yeah, sure, go on in. Because it's 17, what, or I mean, 1880. President Lincoln was only assassinated 16 years ago. So yeah, sure, random crazy dude, come see the president. So he goes sees the president, and he tells the president, he's like, "Hey, so I gave a bunch of speeches in your favor, and then you won." And and Garfield's like, "Yeah, thank you for your support, appreciate it." Godot goes, "Yeah, so I was thinking, ambassador to France, or England is fine too if France is taken. I really either one is good." And Garfield's like, "Huh." And anyway, so he's kicked out. Well, he comes back. This time they pawn him off on the Secretary of State, the Secretary of freaking State. And, same thing. And he's told no. So he keeps coming back and he starts getting rejected from the White House. And so anyway, the ghost of Ulysses S. Grant told him to murder Garfield, and he did. End of story. So yeah, he walks up behind President Garfield while he's standing on a train platform, puts a pistol up against his back and shoots him twice in the back. And what's really crazy is Garfield still would have lived if the doctors had just sewed up his wounds and done nothing. But instead, they dug around in the wound for the bullet. And guess what had not really become a thing by 1880? Washing your hands. You know what was also just barely invented and was still not being super widely used? Toilet paper. So you got doctors with just literally probably microscopic fecal matter on their hands, just digging in there with their bare fingers trying to pull out bullets. They actually did get one bullet out. The other one they never got. Alexander Graham Bell actually brought his newly invented metal detector to try to find the bullet. However, he could not convince them to lay the president on the floor. And so his metal detector did not work because the mattress he was on had metal springs. But anyway, it would have worked otherwise. But anyway, he died 30 days later from sepsis. He had swollen to nearly twice his weight from pus. He died a horrible, painful death, his brain fried by fever. What does this have to do with the Civil Service Act? Well, his vice president, Chester A. Arthur, becomes president. And Chester A. Arthur's like, you know what we need to do? We need to have something in place to prevent people from shooting the president. So we're going to introduce gun control. No, we're going to introduce a test that people have to take before they can get a job with the federal government. That way, some crazy person like Charles Godot would at least have to take a test first. And so that is what the Civil Service Act does. It creates a civil service test, which is a written test you have to take. Your score on it determines which types of government jobs you're eligible for. It does not include elected or appointed positions, though. Well, it might actually involve appointed positions. It doesn't involve elected. But anyway, all right. The Interstate Commerce Commission. I don't have a picture for that. Let's do this one. This is a federal government agency that was created to regulate the railroads. It had no enforcement power and cannot do very much for now. And finally, the Sherman Antitrust Act, the first federal law against monopolies. It's called the Antitrust Act, but it doesn't just regard trust, which, by the way, are legal as long as they don't create a monopoly. It covers all sorts of things. It basically just says It is illegal for any company or combination to engage in practices in restraint of trade. However, it's not enforceable. The only way to enforce it is the attorney general has to sue your company, and then your company goes to court, and the judge decides whether or not your company violated it, and then what to do about that. But on top of that, it could be used against other groups that aren't companies, such as unions, which, if a union goes on strike, they are restraining trade and they are a combination. And that's actually what it mostly ends up being used against. Later, one will more specifically exclude unions and have broader enforcement powers and work better. That's not going to come for a couple of decades, though. And that is my very long lecture over chapter 16. I said I wasn't going to talk about everything in the study guide, but I talked about like 90% of it. The next video will probably be a little shorter, but maybe not. Who could say? Anyway, so I hope this was beneficial to you. I still recommend that you also at least skim the book and, definitely need to go back and fill out the parts of the study guide that I skipped, because those could still definitely show up as identifications on your test. Not to mention, potential essay questions you need to look over. But hopefully it was helpful. And I look forward to our next virtual meeting when we talk about chapter 17 next week. From now, goodbye. See you later. Well, I guess I won't see you, but goodbye.